This is the Check It Out podcast. This is a podcast in a series that we're doing on World War Z, the oral history of the zombie war by Max Brooks, which is our one-book series. This is a podcast on the environment as character. And I'm Troy Swanson.
I'm Tish Hayes.
And I'm Joe Malarkey.
And we're going to talk a little bit about one of the themes of our upcoming one book. I thought this was relevant since there's so much discussion about sustainability on our campuses. One thing that I've noticed reading a lot of post-apocalyptic fiction is that the environment is almost like a character that plays itself out in all of these stories. And I was wondering if we could maybe talk a little bit about how that plays.
It comes up in so many different ways, but I think the thing that I'm super fascinated by is the way the environment is the thing that's going to outlast us. And then in a post-apocalyptic world, it is also the thing that becomes an obstacle to us. So, in the Road, you have, by Cormac McCarthy, you have this man and child traveling down this road. So on one hand, traveling the road is not difficult, but this destroyed environment makes it hard to breathe. It makes it hard to get clean water. Everything that their lives depend on that they used to take for granted is no longer available to them. And just this idea of trying to get to a coast and having to traverse mountains, but having some hope that on a coast there's going to be something safe and something reliable, because how can we have messed up the oceans? I think that's a pretty interesting concept. And I think that comes up a lot. Like, if we can just make it to, this landmark, if we can just make it across the mountains, that comes up in post-apocalyptic fiction a lot, because we no longer have landmarks, that aren't natural spaces.
Right. And it's almost like the environment as desert, like a desert metaphor. So it's because most of us aren't at a point anymore where we could just go out and be self-sufficient, right? Like, I don't have my corn in my livestock in my backyard where I can just easily live off the environment. But the environment, even if it's not a real desert literally, is a place where you can't just go out and find food. The supermarkets are closed in all of these stories. And so the movement through, like you said, finding that point, because right now I can't eat and survive even find clean water, getting to this point where I can is really significant.
And I think so much of the apocalypse that we are concerned about is, in things like Oryx and Crake, The Road, a lot of the other ones that we're huge fans of. It's the environment that is really the environmental crisis is what is the apocalypse. So it's we are, we've destroyed it via nuclear war. We've destroyed it with, the genetically modified crops that we've grown. We've destroyed our water supply because of chemicals we've dumped. So it's... Global warming is such a big theme of recent post-apocalyptic. Right, and so that's the thing that causes the crisis. So the environment in some ways, too, is the thing that we've destroyed. It's also our antagonist, and it's the thing that, we have to wrestle with to kind of get back to any kind of normalcy. The stories would be a different kind of narrative if it wasn't our fault, right? If the characters are implicated in the cause of their current state, right? And I think that's a significant part in how these things unfold. In World War Z, the environment is a character in a lot of ways, and there's so many instances of people who are, like they always say, this world of consultants and lawyers and doctors who can't make a fence to protect themselves, right? And so, how do these people that really don't live in this physical environment, we've worked so hard on our society to buffer ourselves from the environment, are now pushed out in the environment and they think they can live. And there's these, early in World War Z, there's great chapters of people going north because they think they'll be safe and having this kind of camping party that really goes bad once winter hits, right? Right. We don't know how to survive the winter.
Yes, and end up cutting down all the trees, burning tires for warmth, some really ugly stuff.
And interesting that in both World War Z and in the Hunger Games, the kind of safe place is behind the Rocky Mountains. So, you have this retreat back to this huge landmark because we can no longer make our own. Right now, I think we think of New York City as like the most prominent place in the U.S. and it's this place where everything happens. But in a post-apocalyptic world, no, you need something like mountains to protect you.
Right. Yeah. No, I love it. What kind of broader commentaries do we have about sustainability that we see flow through these? And we've hit on some of them.
Well, I think Margaret Atwood is, again, I just keep going back to her because I think Oryx and Crake really shows us where we are so close to. So the way we medically engineer our food, engineer their crops, and how that deeply impacts the way that we live in our world. And so I think it questions all of those practices that we kind of take for granted right now.
Right.
Like we go to the grocery store, we buy things that have been injected with hormones, and she's really asking us, well, just a few years in the future, what is this really going to look like for us?
Mm-hmm. And, being the oldest member of this panel, one of the things which, you, for those of you who are listening and can't see, it's a shift also because post-apocalyptic literature that was published, in sort of mid-20th century from then on, it was basically fear of the post-atomic world. Like after the bomb was dropped, who was going to be left? What was going to be left?
And how do we survive?
And now it's appearing, when you're asking about sustainability, it's appearing more about, that was certainly like a man-made event and a man-made fear, okay? But now it's like we're just chipping away, and and really a lot of what these writers are asking is, where's the tipping point?
Right.
Where is it finally going to flip? And we can't go back. And understand that Moraine Valley Community College does not support any of the political opinions of any of the...
Right.
Thank you.
I think even though, Joe, if you would go back to some of the 20th century post-apocalyptic, like I think about Canticle for Leibowitz, there still tends to be the answer by some authors into smaller communities, more local. Because necessarily you're not going to have a global distribution network after the apocalypse. So communities become local and they grow their own food, and divisions of labor become built around this survival and who does what and whose job is it to guard and whose job is it to grow food and whose job is it to manage and whose job whatever. And so, I think yes, like the nuclear focus happened 50, 60 years ago, but there's even still interesting commentaries that run through that connected with sustainability that fit. So let's take this even broader from post-apocalyptic. I think there's, with the environment, there's a long tradition of thinking about survival stories, and I think of things like White Fang or something more recently, Into the Wild, even something like Moby Dick, where the environment plays a character. And I guess the broad question is, what draws us into those kind of stories?
Well, because that was always sort of the classic theme in literature. It was either like man versus man or man versus nature. And it certainly, when I was, being taught literature, that was kind of the thing. Now, I don't know why woman was always left out of that equation. And part of the thing that I was just always kind of fascinated with when I learned it was like, man versus nature. What, are you kidding me? Nature wins. It's bigger than we are.
Right.
We don't have a chance. Why would you even attempt, to try to stand up to a waterfall? A sheer rock, and any of these things. It just never. But they were fascinating. I remember reading, because you brought up Jack London.
Yeah.
Okay, and I remember reading To Build a Fire, and somebody walked up behind me, and I just threw the book and jumped up in the air, because it was just the point where he was so desperate to get a fire started and couldn't, and he had me. I was just totally like, oh my god, what would I do? So it's that kind of thing. I think we're drawn to and people are always going to be drawn to what's the big challenge? What's the greatest challenge? That's why some of these nutty reality shows exist.
Right. Well,
if we don't do it, we watch somebody else.
Yeah,
do
but
it.
not even the reality shows, right? I was thinking, you mentioned that. I was thinking of Into Thin Air by Krakauer about climbing Everest, and people really
Were
do
they out of
that.
their minds? Who would do this?
It's hard enough to read the story. I can't even imagine doing it, but I think there's that kind of mental test, that thought experiment of how would I survive. What am I made of when when the cards are down? What is in there, and how am I going to stand up to the challenge? And I think that's part of these stories. And I think that the survival story and the post-apocalyptic story, and even something connected to World War Z, is most people won't make it. Am I one that would? Right? Where do I fall?
Right, and it's interesting the differences in approaches that one person struggling against the environment, or do you have like a group of people who band together and help each other survive? And I think the approach that different writers take in dealing with the apocalypse and the post-apocalypse, I think is really interesting, and I think I too love the survival story, but I'm also much more drawn to stories that really explore the group and how can as in this post-apocalyptic world, how do I survive, and how do I find other people who are going to help me survive, and how do we test each other and create something new. Right. And create that family. And I think, that's something that post-apocalyptic literature does well. You have this sudden environment that's terrifying and scary, so how do you find safety? Yeah. And I think, one of those ways is by finding that group and pulling those people together that, might have the skills that you don't.
Well, and I think authors, I think about Octavia Butler, as we mentioned, or even The Hunger Games, where it's fictionalized, but there's many people in our world that don't live too far away from some of that. I mean, we're speaking from a place of sort of privilege on this earth of living, in that it's easier for us, I think, to connect with some of these personal stories when it's fictionalized, and then recognize that the metaphor is for our actual existence. Like, it's not just something that someone's making up, but they're telling us a story that's to teach us a lesson about what we're doing now, and that there's people that live in, I think about the sweatshop that collapsed in South Asia, that's just awful existence that people do that we benefit from, and that this is also part of the conversation around these stories that I think we shouldn't miss. So on that note,
on that cheerful note.
Yes. I mean, I think that's why this book works as a one book, because it is a serious topic, and we're going to be having these kind of conversations throughout the year, so I would invite our listeners to come in the library and join us for these the panels and lectures. Visit our one book website, www.morainevalley.edu/wwz. Any other closing thoughts?
No, thanks for joining us.
Okay, thanks for joining us. You can find the book in the library and in the bookstore.